Luke Mallory felt the grit of the trail deep in his bones. 3 months driving cattle north to the railhead had worn the leather of his chaps thin and carved new lines around his eyes. The town of Laramie Fork wasn't much, just a cluster of false front buildings huddling against the wind. But it was the closest thing to home he had. The high plains of Wyoming stretched out in every direction, unforgiving and vast, a place that dried a man out, body and soul. He swung down from his horse, the stiffness in his knees a sharp reminder that he wasn't 20 anymore. He handed the reins to the stable boy, slapped the dust from his hat against his thigh, and headed for the saloon. He needed 2 things, whiskey to cut the trail dust and silence to settle his mind. He got neither. The rusted spur was thick with the midday smoke of cheap cigars and the low, persistent murmur of gossip. Luke took his glass of rye to a corner table, easing his long frame onto the rickety chair. He was a man who preferred to listen. His face settled into the quiet, watchful expression of someone who had seen too much and said too little. He'd learned long ago that town gossip was a sickness, a kind of prairie fever that infected the idle, and he wanted no part of it. But today, the talk was unavoidable. It wasn't of cattle prices, or the drought, or the troubles with the railroad. It was of that woman, living down by the river. Silas Croft, the blacksmith, muttered to the barman, his voice a low rumble. In the old trapper's lean-to, ain't fit for a dog. Heard she had a child with her, another man added, his boots scraping the floor as he leaned in. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the side of the pot-bellied stove. A bastard, plain and simple. Shame on this town. Letting her stay. Luke kept his head down, tracing the rim of his glass. He didn't know the woman and didn't care to. His business was his own. It's Jameson's girl, the barman clarified, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. Clara Jameson. Used to work up at the Finch Ranch. Good, decent girl, I thought, till she got herself in trouble with Harlan Finch. Got herself in trouble, Silas snorted. That ain't the story I heard. I heard she seduced him, threw herself at the boy, thinking she'd trap him. When the old man found out, he ran her off. Now she's back, trying to pin the brat on him. Harlan's a married man now, the other man said, shaking his head with false piety. A terrible thing, to bring that kind of shame to his wife. That woman, her name is Filth. Luke finished his whiskey, the liquor burning a path down his throat. It didn't warm him. He pushed back from the table and walked out, the gossip clinging to him like mud. While the men drank and judged, Clara Jameson was fighting. The lean-to they spoke of was a ruin, little more than rotting planks and canvas scraps dragged between 2 cottonwoods. The gaps in the walls were plugged with mud and straw, but the wind found every one. It didn't just whistle through. It screamed, a constant, high-pitched mourner. She lived on the absolute edge of things, the edge of town, the edge of starvation, the edge of sanity. Her only anchor, the only thing that kept the wind from scouring her away, was the small, whimpering bundle clutched to her chest. Her son, Samuel. He was 3 months old and had never known a full belly or a warm room. Clara survived on what the town discarded. She rose before dawn, when the shame was asleep, and scavenged behind the general store for wilted vegetables or potatoes too soft to sell. Sometimes Mrs. Davies, the storekeeper's wife, would leave a heel of stale bread on a barrel top, a gesture that felt like equal parts charity and contempt. When her fingers weren't numb with cold, she did needlework. She was fine with a needle, her stitches small and perfect. She mended shirts for miners and drifters who passed through and didn't know her name, men who paid in pennies, or sometimes, blessedly, a handful of flour or a scoop of beans. It was never enough. The hunger was a constant. Dull ache deep in her belly, an ache she ignored. But the cold was the immediate enemy, a predator circling the flimsy shack. At night, the lean-to became a tomb of ice. The fire, small and smoky, would die by midnight, the fuel too precious to burn till dawn. Clara would wrap Samuel in every rag she owned, scraps of her old dress, a piece of horse blanket she'd found by the river. She would strip off her own thin shawl and add it to his bundle, then pull him against her bare skin, huddling under one threadbare blanket. She would lie awake for hours, rigid, listening to the coyotes howl, listening to the shallow, rasping breaths of her child. Tears would well and slide, hot down her temples, freezing on her hair. She never made a sound when she cried. Crying was a luxury, a waste of heat and energy. She had to survive for him. His tiny, fragile life depended on her grit, and her grit was all she had left. Luke needed supplies for his own cabin, miles out of town. He'd spent the day settling accounts, his mind already turning to the repairs needed on his roof before the real snows hit. The air was sharp, biting. An early, hard frost had silvered the ground, making the packed dirt of the street hard as iron. He was tying a sack of oats to his pack mule when he saw her. She was down toward the cottonwoods that lined the frozen river, moving in the gray morning light. She was gathering fallen branches, her movements quick and desperate, like a sparrow snatching crumbs before the hawks arrived. The wind was cruel, whipping her threadbare skirt around her legs, tangling her dark, uncombed hair across her face. He saw the flash of pale skin, white against the frozen mud. She was barefoot. The sight stopped him cold. He stood frozen, the rope slack in his hand. It was a poverty he understood, a desperation that went beyond bad luck or poor choices. This was the bottom. This was what happened when the world turned its back completely. She must have felt his gaze. She froze, clutching the meager bundle of sticks to her chest. Her head lifted slowly. Her face was thin, almost hollowed out by hunger and fear. Her cheekbones sharp as blades. But her eyes were not weak. They were fierce, defiant, and cornered. They met his across the frozen expanse, a distance of perhaps 50 yards that felt like a canyon. Luke didn't know what the town saw. He didn't see a seductress or a sinner. He saw a woman fighting a war she was losing, and fighting it alone. He did the only thing that felt decent. He gave a slow, respectful nod. It was like striking a wild animal. The fierceness in her eyes shattered, replaced instantly by a wave of pure, agonizing shame. Her gaze dropped. She turned, clutching her sticks, and hurried away. Slipping once on the ice-slicked mud, she didn't look back, disappearing into the tangle of gray willows near the riverbank. Luke stood there a long moment. The image of her bare feet on the frost burned into his mind. He tied the rope with a savage jerk and swung into his saddle, his jaw set. Clara stumbled back into the shack, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. He saw me. He saw me. He saw my feet. The nod was worse than the jeers. The pity was a hot iron against her skin. She barricaded the flimsy door with a log and sank to the dirt floor, pulling Samuel from his nest of rags. He was cold. His skin felt like chilled wax. She pressed him to her, rocking, trying to give him her own failing warmth. The memory, the one she fought back every day with teeth and nails, clawed its way up her throat. She hadn't seduced anyone. She had been scrubbing the floor in the main kitchen of the Finch ranch, her arms aching, her mind on the small room she kept above the stables. Harlan Finch, the owner's son, had returned from some fancy Eastern school, bringing with him the smell of whiskey and cigars and an entitlement that hung on him like a fine coat. He'd always watched her. She'd felt his eyes on her back when she hung laundry, on her legs when she climbed the stairs. She'd tried to stay away, to make herself small and invisible, but that night the kitchen was empty. The other staff were gone. He'd come in, his boots loud on the clean floor. He'd backed her against the tall flour sacks, his smile lazy. She'd told him no, her voice trembling. She'd told him to stop. She'd fought. She still had the pale, thin scar on her wrist where he'd twisted her arm, the memory of his heavy, liquor-soaked breath. His hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her cries. When it was over, he'd straightened his collar, told her to be smart, and left. She was broken, but the shame was worse than the pain. She waited 2 days, sick with dread, before she finally, tearfully. Told Mrs. Finch, Harlan's mother. The woman had looked at her, not with sympathy, but with an assessing, icy disdain. "You lying, filthy girl," she'd said, her voice quiet and venomous. "Trying to ruin my son who is engaged to a fine woman in Cheyenne. Get out of my house." They'd thrown her out that same day. No wages, no coat, just the dress she was wearing. She walked for 2 days, sleeping in ditches, the shame a living thing coiled in her belly. She was aiming for nowhere, just away. The pain started during a blizzard, catching her on the open plain. She'd found a barn, empty save for a single, lonely cow. She had given birth to Samuel alone on a pile of dirty straw. The cow's warm breath steaming in the dark, her own screams swallowed by the howl of the wind. She'd bitten through the cord herself, like an animal, wrapped the screaming, bloody baby in her own shawl, and curled up, praying for death. Death hadn't come, only the cold, and the baby's insistent cry. That night, Luke was back in the saloon. He shouldn't have been. He should have been at his cabin, but the image of the woman's bare feet wouldn't leave him. He was on his 3rd whiskey, and it wasn't working. The talk had turned to her again, louder this time, emboldened by the whiskey. "Saw Luke Mallory staring her down by the river this morning," Silas Croft said, his voice carrying clear across the room. He grinned, showing brown teeth. "Thinking of sampling the wares, Luke?" A few men laughed. Another one, a drifter Luke didn't know, leaned over. "Better watch yourself, cowboy. Trouble like that sticks. A man can get ruined by a woman like that. You'll regret her." Luke's hand tightened on his glass until his knuckles were white. He didn't look up. Regret. The word was a spur in his gut, twisted sharp. He knew regret. He lived with it. He breathed it in like the dust. His mind flashed back, not to the prairie, but to a crowded, smoke-filled brothel in Cheyenne. 5 years gone. His younger brother, Ethan, barely 18, full of liquor and foolishness, trying to prove he was a man. He'd picked a fight with a card sharp over a girl. Luke had stepped in. He'd always stepped in, always fixed Ethan's messes, always pulled him from the fire, but this time, his own anger, his own weariness with his brother's recklessness, had been too hot. He'd grabbed the card sharp and thrown him back. The man had stumbled, fallen against a table, and come up with a gun. The bullet wasn't meant for Ethan. Luke saw it coming, but Ethan, drunk and trying to be a hero for the first time in his life, had jumped between them. Luke had held his brother while he bled out on the filthy, beer-soaked floorboards. Ethan's last breath had been a wet, confused rattle. "Luke, you'll regret her." He regretted everything. He regretted the fight, regretted the brothel, regretted not getting Ethan out of that town and onto a horse, headed anywhere else. He regretted the suffocating silence that had settled over his life ever since. He finished his whiskey, the glass slamming down on the table with a crack. The saloon quieted. Luke stood up slowly. He stared at the drifter who'd spoken. His eyes were flat, gray, and cold as the river ice. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. Then he turned and walked out. The batwing doors swung shut behind him, leaving the men in a silence he'd created. 2 days passed. A bitter wind drove pellets of sleet across the plains, rattling the windows of the town. Luke was finally loading the last of his supplies onto his pack mule, ready to ride out to his cabin and hole up for the winter. He was tying down the canvas when he heard a cry from up the street, near the general store. It wasn't a loud cry. It was a gasp, a small, choked sound. He looked over. Mrs. Davies, the storekeeper's wife, was standing on the boardwalk, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, on the ground. In the half-frozen mud of the street was Clara Jameson. She lay crumpled on her side, a small, empty flour sack clutched in her hand. She wasn't moving. A small crowd gathered, but no one stepped off the boardwalk. They stared. They whispered. "Drunk, probably," someone muttered. "Fainted from shame," a woman said, pulling her child close to her skirts. "Serves her right." Luke moved. He didn't think. He just acted. The weariness of his life fell away, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He crossed the street in 3 long strides. He knelt beside her in the mud. Her face was the color of old ash. Her lips were blue and cracked. She was breathing, but it was a shallow, fragile thing. He slipped his arm under her back to lift her head. She was lighter than a sack of feed, starved down to nothing but bone and will. He heard the whispers at his back. "Don't touch her, Luke. It's God's judgment." He ignored them. He slid one arm under her back, the other under her knees. He lifted her. She weighed nothing. Her head lolled back against his shoulder. Her damp hair fell across his arm. He felt a fierce, protective anger surge through him, an anger directed at the whispering faces on the boardwalk. He turned, carrying her, and walked straight through the crowd. They parted for him, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and fear. He fixed his eyes on the small, painted sign down the street, Doc Evans. He kicked the door open with his boot. The bell jangled wildly. Doc Evans, an old man with tired eyes and hands stained with chemicals, looked up from his desk. He saw Luke. He saw the woman in his arms. His face didn't change. "On the cot, Luke," the doctor said, his voice level. He didn't ask questions. Luke laid her down gently on the narrow cot. As he did, her eyes flickered open. They were wide, unfocused, and filled with a terrifying, vacant shame. She saw him and tried to pull away, a soundless gasp escaping her lips. "Easy, girl," Doc Evans said, pushing her gently back down. He pressed his fingers to her wrist, then pulled back the collar of her dress to listen to her heart. "Starvation," he said flatly, looking at Luke. "And exposure. She's half frozen. Where's the child?" "At her shack, I suppose," Luke said, his voice rough. The doctor straightened up, his face grim. "She won't last long if she goes back there, and a baby can't survive this cold alone, not for one night." Luke left the doctor's office. He walked, his boots heavy with mud, to the general store. He stepped inside. The whispering stopped. Mrs. Davies stood behind the counter, her arms crossed. "Flour," Luke said. "Bacon, coffee, and a tin of that condensed milk." She gathered the items, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. She slammed them on the counter. "That'll be $1.20. Luke paid. He added a bottle of strong whiskey from the shelf, the kind used more for medicine than pleasure. He didn't say thank you. He took the sack and left. He rode to the river. The shack was worse up close than it had been from a distance. The wind cut right through it. He pushed the flimsy door open. A tiny, mewling sound came from a nest of rags in the corner. Luke stopped. He wasn't a man who knew children. He'd avoided them. They reminded him of Ethan, of a softness he couldn't afford. But this was just a small, struggling thing. He went to the bundle. The baby. Samuel was wrapped tightly, but he was shivering. His face was flushed a dangerous, bright red, and his breathing was a dry, rasping noise. Fever. Luke worked fast. He used his own axe on a deadfall nearby, splitting seasoned wood until he had a decent pile. He got a fire going in the pitiful, rusted stove, using his own kindling, the shack filled with smoke. But then, for the first time in months, it filled with warmth. He rode back to town as the sun was setting, painting the sky a brutal, bloody red. Clara was awake when he entered the doctor's office. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, sipping a cup of hot broth Doc Evans had given her. She looked terrified, poised to run. "Your boy has a fever," Luke said. His voice was quiet, not unkind. He didn't wait for a reply. "I'm taking you home." Doc Evans nodded, stuffing a small blue bottle into Luke's hand. "This is quinine, for the baby's fever. 1 drop in some water, no more. You understand? She's weak, but the broth will hold her. She needs food." Luke stepped toward her. Clara flinched, pulling back against the wall. "I won't hurt you," Luke said, his voice low. He was gentle. He wrapped the blanket from the cot around her shoulders and, Before she could protest, he lifted her again. This time, she was awake, rigid with humiliation in his arms. Her face turned away. He put her on his horse, which he'd left tied outside. He didn't mount. He took the reins and walked beside her, leading the animal through the dark, cold streets, down the path to the river. When they got to the shack, the fire was burning warm and bright. The air inside was almost hot. He helped her down, and she scrambled from his grasp, stumbling immediately to the corner, crying out when she saw the baby. She snatched him up, clutching him to her chest, checking his breath. She looked at the stacked firewood. She looked at the sacks of food on the small, broken table. She looked at Luke. Her eyes were wide with mistrust, like a cornered wolf expecting a trap. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, broken from disuse and fear. Luke didn't answer her question. He took the one dirty pot he'd seen by the stove, took it outside, and scoured it with snow until it was clean. He came back in, filled it with water from his own canteen, and started making a stew. He cut up slices of bacon, added flour and water to make rough dumplings, and dropped them into the pot. Clara watched him, her gaze flicking from his large, calloused hands to the baby, to the door. She was shaking, from cold and hunger and a terror so deep it had become part of her. Luke set the pot near the fire to simmer. The smell of bacon and hot broth filled the tiny space, a smell of life and sustenance. He put the bottle of whiskey and the small blue bottle of quinine on the table. "The doctor said 1 drop of the quinine," he said, his voice gruff. "The whiskey's for the fever, a spoonful for the boy. Or rub it on his chest. It'll sweat it out." He looked at her, at the tiny, sick child she clutched. He wanted to say something, to tell her she wasn't alone, to curse the town, but the words wouldn't come. His guilt over Ethan, his ingrained loneliness, his abiding anger at the world, it all choked him. He'd done what he could. He gave her a single nod, the same as he had at the river. He backed out of the shack and pulled the door closed, leaving them in the warmth. Inside. Clara stared at the door. She listened until the sound of his horse's hooves faded completely, swallowed by the wind. She was alone again, but the shack was warm. The baby coughed, a dry, painful sound, and she rocked him, her heart aching. She looked at the medicine. She looked at the stew, steaming by the fire, her hands shaking so badly she could barely do it. She managed to get 1 drop of the quinine into a spoonful of water and gently fed it to Samuel. She wrapped him tightly and held him close to the stove. Then, she dipped a wooden spoon into the pot. The stew was hot. It burned her throat, but it was the first real food she'd tasted in weeks. It was thick and salty and wonderful. She sank to the dirt floor by the stove, eating the stew from the pot, her gaze fixed on her sleeping, feverish child, and quietly, with no one to see, no one to judge. She cried into the steam, her shoulders shaking. The snow came early and hard, a white fist that punched the plains flat, burying the world. The wind drove it, piling drifts against the small shack by the river until it looked less like a building and more like a mound of frozen earth. The world shrank to the size of that one smoky room. For Clara, it was a tomb. For Luke, it was a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't shrug off. He didn't ride out to his own cabin. The passes would be thick with snow, and his roof was sound enough for now. He stayed in town, using the small room behind the stables he sometimes rented. But his days found their rhythm in the trail he packed down to the river. He came every day, uninvited, steady as the cold. He never knocked. She would just hear the crunch of his boots in the snow, a shadow falling across the single, grime-caked window. He was a man of action, not words. The small, broken building offended his sense of order. First, he fixed the door. The old one was a collection of warped planks that let the wind in through a dozen gaps. He brought new hinges he'd bartered from Silas Croft, and 2 thick planks of pine he'd found behind the lumber mill. He worked for hours in the biting cold, his breath pluming, his hands bare as he measured and sawed. He didn't just repair the door. He rebuilt it, making it heavy and sound. When he hung it, it shut with a solid, satisfying thump. It was the first time in months Clara had felt a barrier between her and the world. He brought supplies: flour, a slab of salt pork, coffee, lard, things that cost money, things she could never get. He would set them on the small table without a word, his gaze fixed on the stove or the wood pile. Never on her. He was careful not to look at her like he was paying for something. He set a line of traps in the willows by the frozen river. Every morning, he would check them, and more often than not, he'd return with 2 or 3 rabbits. He'd skin and gut them with a few efficient, brutal movements of his knife, handing her the dressed meat and tossing the pelts in a pile by the door. "Boil these," he'd said once, pointing to the meat. "Long as you can, for the boy." She watched him, always from the shadow of the doorway, holding Samuel wrapped tight. She didn't trust him. Kindness was a currency she couldn't afford, a debt she couldn't repay. But as the stack of firewood grew, as the smell of rabbit stew filled the small room, as the door held the wind at bay, the hard knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. Just a fraction. One afternoon, the wind died. The world was utterly silent, muffled in white. Luke had been outside for an hour, reinforcing the flimsy north wall with sod and packed snow. He finished, stamping the feeling back into his feet, and pushed the new door open. The shack was warm. Clara was sitting on her cot, but she stood when he entered. A gesture of respect she hadn't shown before. The baby was asleep in his box. I made tea," she said. Her voice was so low he barely heard it. It was the first time she had offered him anything. He stopped, his big frame filling the doorway, and looked at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her own hands to stop them from shaking. She was terrified he would refuse. He unwrapped the scarf from his neck and slowly, deliberately, ducked his head to enter the room. "Thank you," he said. His voice was gruff, but the words were polite. She hurried to the stove and poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup, adding a pinch of the tea leaves he had brought. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his. She snatched her hand back as if burned. He took the cup and sipped. It was weak and scalding hot. "It's good." She nodded, retreating to her cot, pulling the blanket around her. He stood by the stove, sipping the tea. The silence stretched, filled by the small sounds of the fire and the sleeping child. He glanced at the box. "The boy, he looks stronger." "He is," she whispered. "The broth." Luke nodded. He took another sip. "He got a name?" Her whole body went rigid. A name was a claim. A name was something that could be taken, something to be written in a book, something to be shamed. She looked down at her hands, nodded in her lap. "Samuel. Samuel." He tasted the name. It felt solid. "That's a good, strong name." After his PA, he meant it as a simple question, a way to make talk. He did not understand what it cost her. Her head snapped up, her eyes suddenly blazing with the old, cornered animal fear. "Named after no one," she said, her voice flat and cold as the ice on the river. "Just Samuel." Luke recognized the boundary. He saw the wall go up, saw the shutters drop over her eyes. He'd hit the nerve, the place where the wound was raw. He gave a slow nod. "Just Samuel, then," he said, holding his cup. "It suits him." They sat in the quiet again, but it was a different quiet. It was charged. He was too large for the room, his presence overwhelming. She was acutely aware of him, of the way his shoulders strained the seams of his coat, of the faint smell of tobacco and cold pine that clung to him, of the fact that they were alone, man and woman, shut in by a world of snow. She was beautiful, he realized, not in the way the saloon girls were, with their paint and feathers. Her beauty was in the fine, clear line of her jaw, the startling, deep blue of her eyes, the thick, dark hair she kept tied back with a string. It was a beauty that had been starved and beaten down, but it was still there, like a stubborn spring flower pushing up through ice. And she was watching him. Her eyes, he saw, were never still. They darted to him, then to the door, then to Samuel, then back to him. She was always scanning for rejection, for the first sign of anger or judgment, ready to flinch, ready to run. The sight of it made something hard and angry settle in Luke's chest. A few nights later, a new cold snap descended. The temperature dropped so low the trees snapped like gunfire in the frozen dark. Luke rode to the shack late, delayed by a lame horse. He'd been worried the fire would be low. He pushed the door open to near blackness. The stove was breathing only the faintest red embers. Clara was standing by the table, fumbling with the oil lamp, her back to him. She was shaking. He could see her thin shoulders trembling violently. A match scraped, flared, and died. I can't. She was whispering, her voice a thin thread of panic. It's frozen. Oh, God, he's so cold. Another match scraped. The tiny flame illuminated her fingers, red and raw, shaking so badly she couldn't bring it to the wick. The match went out. A small, choked sob broke from her. Here, Luke said, his voice quiet. She gasped and spun around, her hand flying to her chest. He moved past her, into the small, dark space. He didn't take the lamp. He took her hands. He closed his own large, calloused hands completely around her small, frozen ones. She was so cold she felt like sculpted ice. She went utterly still, her breath held, her head bowed. He chafed them, gently, firmly. He rubbed his thumbs over her knuckles, forcing his own heat into her skin. He didn't look at her face. He just looked at their hands, his dark and scarred, covering hers, pale and delicate. A flicker. It was not just his warmth. It was a jolt, a current of life that passed from him to her. It ran up her arms and made her heart, which had been hammering with fear, stop for a single beat. He felt it too. A sudden, sharp pull deep in his gut. A recognition. It was the first time in 5 years he had truly felt another person. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He held her hands for a long moment, longer than was needed just for warmth. The only sound was her short, shaky breaths. Then, gently, he let go. He turned to the lamp. He took his pocket knife and shaved the frozen wick, primed it with a drop of whiskey from the flask he carried, and struck his own match. The flame caught, steady and bright. A small, yellow circle of light pushed back the shadows, revealing her face. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted, her cheeks stained with tears he hadn't seen. Neither of them spoke. He turned from her and began, methodically, to build up the fire. The town knew, in a place as small as Laramie Fork, with so many eyes and so few distractions. His path to the river was as good as a proclamation. The gossip, which had been a low murmur, turned sharp. Luke went to the general store for more flour and quinine. The men at the stove fell silent. Mrs. Davies counted out his change, her lips pressed into a thin, white line of disapproval. When he stepped back onto the boardwalk, Sheriff Brody was waiting for him. Brody was a decent man, paid to keep the peace, and the peace was fragile. Luke, he nodded, shifting his tobacco to the other cheek. Sheriff, a word, if you please. Brody gestured with his head toward the alley between the store and the bank. Luke followed him. You're making folks uneasy. Luke, the sheriff said, his voice low. Your visits, down there. I'm keeping a woman and a child from freezing to death. That against the law now? It's against custom. She's a fallen woman. Luke, she's trouble. Harlan Finch's father. He sits on the town council. He don't like her being here, and he sure as hell don't like you. Encouraging her. Encouraging her to what? To breathe. You know what I mean. Folks are saying you're taking advantage, that you're no better than she is. A man like you, with a land, with a name, you get tied up with someone like that. Her stain gets on you. It's for your own good. Stay away from her. Luke looked at the sheriff. His gray eyes were flat, cold as a gun barrel. My business is my own. You keep the peace, Brody. You let the pastor worry about the souls. He walked away, leaving the sheriff sighing in the alley. But the pastor was next. On Sunday, Luke was in his stable, mending a harness, when Pastor Miles appeared. The pastor was a thin, severe man who saw sin in every shadow. "Mr. Mallory, I had hoped to see you in the Lord's house." "I'm busy." "Pastor," Luke didn't look up, his hand steady on the leather strap. "You are busy with the devil's work," the pastor's voice snapped. "You are consorting with a harlot. You are bringing shame upon this community, which had welcomed you. That woman is a vessel of sin. The town will not stand for it. You are giving comfort to the wicked, and you will be judged alongside her." She was starving. Her child was sick. Her suffering is the wage of her sin. It is God's will. You interfere with God's judgment. Mr. Mallory, leave her to the fate she has earned. She will be your ruin. Luke stopped his work. He slowly, deliberately, put down the awl and the leather. He stood up, unfolding to his full height, and turned to face the smaller man. "You preached about charity last Easter," Luke said, his voice quiet, which made it more dangerous. "About the Good Samaritan. Or does that parable not apply when the person in the ditch is a woman?" The pastor's face went red. "You are twisting scripture to justify your own base urges. You'll regret this, Mallory. You'll regret her." "The only thing I'll regret," Luke said, "is listening to men who hide behind a book instead of helping a person in need. Get out of my stable." The pastor, sputtering about fire and brimstone, retreated. The warnings did nothing but harden Luke's resolve. The hypocrisy of the town was a bitter taste in his mouth. He rode out of town that afternoon, checking his fences, his mind dark, ruin, regret. He'd been avoiding ruin for 5 years. He'd lived in the shadow of regret every single day. His mind went back, as it always did, to the brothel in Cheyenne, to the smell of cheap perfume and stale beer. Ethan, his younger brother, always chasing trouble, as the sheriff would say. A girl, a card sharp, a stupid, drunken argument. Luke hadn't just been trying to break up a fight. He'd been cold with anger. He'd been disgusted. With Ethan. With the painted girl. With the whole damned filthy place. He'd grabbed the card sharp with a righteous fury. And that righteousness, that cold, hard pride, had made him slow. It had given the man time to pull his gun. He saw it all in flashes. The smoke, the girl's scream, Ethan's look of stupid surprise as he fell. Luke had held him. He'd felt the life pour out, hot and fast, onto the filthy floor. Guilt. He'd avoided women ever since. He'd avoided connection. He'd built a wall around himself, cold and high. He'd become a man of silence. The town called Clara a harlot, just as they'd called that girl. They judged her, just as he had judged. But when he looked at Clara, he didn't see a sinner. He saw a girl barefoot in the snow. He saw a mother fighting for her child. The town's judgment felt like the same sickness that had gotten Ethan killed. His guilt was a wall, but his anger at them, at their false piety, was a battering ram. He turned his horse back to town. He realized she was still walking to the river in those thin, cracked shoes, wearing nothing but his old blanket. He went straight to the general store. Mrs. Davies was alone. "I need a woman's coat," he said, his voice flat. She looked at him, her face a mask of stone. "We don't serve her kind. I'm not asking you to serve her. I need a woman's coat, the warmest one you have, and boots, size, small. I won't." "Mrs. Davies," Luke interrupted, his voice dropping. "You can sell me a coat, or I can ride to Cheyenne, and when I'm there, I'll be sure to tell the mercantile there that Laramie Fork is a fine town, but they let women and children freeze in the street. I wonder how that'll sound. Come the spring." Her eyes narrowed with hate, but business was business. Silently, she went to the back. She returned with a heavy, wool-lined canvas coat, the kind a rancher's wife might wear. It was brown, plain, and thick. She found a pair of small, fur-lined boots. $3. He threw $3 silver on the counter. They rang loud in the silent store. He found Clara by the riverbank. trying to break the ice in the waterhole with a stick. She was wrapped in the threadbare blanket, shaking in the wind. He walked up to her and held out the coat and boots. She stopped, staring at the items. She looked at them, then at his face. She didn't move. She just watched him, her eyes wide with mistrust. "Take them," he said. "It's too cold." She shook her head, taking a step back. "I can't." "Why not?" It's too much." Her voice was a ragged whisper. "I can't pay you. I don't want. People will say—" She stopped, her face flooding with shame. She thought he was buying her. The thought made him sick. It was what the town believed. It was what she had been taught to expect. He dropped the items in the snow and grabbed her, not roughly, but with a force that stopped her trembling. He held her by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I don't give a damn what people say," he said, his voice low and fierce, cutting through the wind. "I am not them. I am not him." She gasped, her eyes wide. He knew. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "I am helping you because no one else will, and you do not deserve this." She searched his face, her whole body rigid, looking for the lie, the angle. She found none. She saw only his gray, steady eyes, and in them, a deep, abiding anger that was not, for the first time, directed at her. The fight went out of her. The tension left her shoulders. Slowly, her hand trembling. She reached down and touched the sleeve of the coat. The fragile piece lasted 3 days. Then, Samuel's fever returned. This was not the low, rasping sickness from before. This was a fire. The quinine did nothing. The baby's skin was flushed a dangerous, bright red, his breathing a high, thin whistle that cut Clara to the bone. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't wake. He just lay in her arms, burning. Luke arrived at dusk to find her frantic. She was pacing the small shack, her hair wild, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't crying. She was beyond tears. "He's dying," she whispered, her voice hollow. She rocked the limp, hot bundle. "He's dying. It's my fault. I'm too weak. I couldn't feed him enough. My milk. It's just water. It's my fault." "Hush." Luke touched the baby's forehead. The heat was a shock. He'd seen this fever in men on the trail. It was the kind that broke one way or the other by sunrise. "Get the stove as hot as you can make it," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through her panic. "Boil water. Now. Clara." The use of her name, the sharp command, broke her paralysis. She stumbled to the stove and began stuffing wood into it. Luke sat on the single stool. He unwrapped the baby from his blankets, his movements quick and sure. The small body was mottled red. "Give me your blanket," he said, nodding to the one on her cot. She handed it to him. He unbuttoned his own heavy flannel shirt. He held the baby, naked save for a small rag, directly against his own bare chest. The heat from the child was like holding a hot stone. He wrapped the thick wool blanket around both of them, sealing in his own body heat, creating a small, dark, warm cave. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "He's fighting," Luke said, his voice grim. "He's using all his strength to stay warm while the fever burns him up. I'll keep him warm for him. All he has to do is fight the sickness." He began to rock, a slow, steady, side-to-side motion. The night became a living thing. The wind howled outside, a high, lonely scream. Inside, the stove roared, the small room growing stiflingly hot. The only other sounds were the click of the rocking stool on the dirt floor and Clara's choked, silent sobs. Luke didn't stop. His arms ached, his back muscles seized, but he held the small, burning body against his heart, feeling the child's frantic, hummingbird pulse. He rocked, and he rocked. It was the darkest part of the night, 3 a.m, maybe 4, the time when life is at its thinnest. Samuel's breathing was barely a whisper, a shallow puff of air. Then a long, terrifying stillness. Clara was on her knees by the cot, her head buried in her arms. She had given up. She was praying for it to be over, for his suffering to end. Luke was not. He was still rocking, his jaw set, his face carved from stone in the lamplight. "Come on, boy," he whispered into the blanket, his voice a low growl. "You fight. You hear me? You fight." Clara lifted her head. She saw him, this large, rough man, bent over her child, his face a mask of fierce, stubborn concentration. He was pouring his own life, his own will, into her son. She crawled across the dirt floor. She knelt beside his chair. He didn't look at her. His eyes were closed, his focus absolute. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his hand, the one that wasn't holding the baby, the one resting, white-knuckled, on his knee. It was a big, scarred hand. She lowered her head and pressed her lips to his knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of supplication, of gratitude, of absolute, bottomless despair. It was the only thing she had to give. A gesture of ultimate surrender. Luke went rigid. His rocking stopped for a single beat. A jolt went through him, sharp and hot, entirely different from the lamp. It was a deep, powerful current of desire, so sudden and so strong it nearly made him gasp. It was tangled with her sorrow, her fear, and it was the most potent thing he had ever felt. He wanted to pull her up, into his lap. He wanted to hold her, to shield her, to bury his face in her hair. He wanted to feel her lips on his, but he stayed still. His hand remained flat on his knee. To move now, to take advantage of her at her most broken, would make him no better than Harlan Finch. It would make him exactly the man the town already believed him to be. He clenched his jaw so hard it ached. He turned his head, just slightly, and looked down at the dark crown of her head. Then, he closed his eyes and started rocking again. The gray light of dawn, cold and thin, began to seep through the cracks in the walls. The lamp guttered, its oil spent. Luke was exhausted, his body a single, dull ache. And then he felt it, a change. The baby, who had been limp and burning hot, suddenly shivered, a small, violent tremor that shook his whole body. Luke pulled the blanket back. Samuel's face, which had been bright red, was now pale, and he was wet. A thin film of sweat covered his forehead and chest. He let out a small, weak cry. It was not the whistle of before. It was a cry of complaint. "Clara," Luke said. His voice was cracked, rough with exhaustion. She scrambled to him, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. "He's wet," Luke said. "He's sweating. The fever, it broke." Clara stared. She reached out a shaking finger and touched the baby's cheek. It was cool, damp. A sound tore from her throat, a sound that was half sob, half scream. It was the first loud noise he had ever heard her make. "Oh, God! Oh, Samuel!" Luke gently, carefully, handed the baby to her. She snatched him, clutching him to her chest, burying her face against his small, damp body, rocking him. And then the strength that had held her up for so many months, the iron will that had kept her alive, finally shattered. She turned and fell against Luke. Her arms went around his neck, her face pressed into the damp wool of his shirt, right over his heart. She clung to him. She sobbed, not the silent, hopeless tears of the night, but a storm of grief and relief, of terror and gratitude that shook her from head to foot. Luke was frozen for a moment. The feel of her, the warmth of her, the sudden, complete weight of her trust. It overwhelmed him. Slowly, his arms came up. One hand settled on her narrow back, the other cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her soft, loose hair. He held her. He held her as the sun came up, his cheek resting on the top of her head. He held the woman and the child. The small shack was filled with the sound of her crying, and the smell of the dying fire, and the unspoken desperate need of two broken people. Finally holding on, the snows melted with the sound of a great, weary sigh. The plains, which had been a flat, dead white, slowly revealed their bones, gray rock and brown, matted grass, then, almost overnight, a pale, hesitant green misted the land. The river, unlocked from its ice, rushed high and muddy, carrying the last of the winter downstream. That brutal, confining winter had changed everything. The night Samuel's fever broke, the wall of cold courtesy between Luke and Clara had cracked for good. He was no longer just a provider. He was the man who had held her son against his own skin and refused to let him die. She was no longer just a woman he pitied. She was the woman who had knelt and kissed his hand in gratitude. With the thaw, Luke could finally ride out to his own cabin, miles west of town. But he found he spent less time there and more time at the shack by the river. They fell into a new rhythm, one of quiet domesticity. He didn't just bring supplies, he stayed. He brought a shovel and a hoe from his own stores. Behind the shack, in the small patch of land that got the morning sun, he broke the hard, damp earth. The work was heavy, and he grunted with the effort, his shirt sticking to the muscles in his back. Clara watched him for an hour, holding Samuel. Then, wordlessly, she handed him the baby, took the small sack of seeds he'd brought, and began to follow in his path, dropping corn and beans into the dark soil. They worked like that for hours, a silent, coordinated team. He chopped wood, not just enough for the day, but building a real wood pile, a high, neat stack that spoke of permanence. She would follow, gathering the smaller chips and kindling. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer the empty, cold space of strangers. It was a shared quiet, full of understanding. One afternoon, Samuel, who was sitting on a blanket in the new grass, reached for a butterfly and toppled over. He wasn't hurt, but the surprise made him let out a high, clear bubble of sound. It was his first laugh. Luke, who was mending the roof, stopped. He looked down at the boy, and a slow, unused smile cracked the grim set of his face. Clara, hanging laundry on a line Luke had strung, saw it. She saw the lines around his eyes soften, the sudden warmth in his expression. A small, rusty sound escaped her own throat. It was the first time he had ever heard her laugh. It was a sound as fragile and new as the spring itself. It startled them both into silence, their eyes meeting. And for a moment, they were just a man and a woman, standing in the sun, sharing a moment of peace. The peace made them both careless. It made them soft. A week later, the air was warm, smelling of pine and damp earth. They were down by the riverbank. Samuel was asleep on his blanket. Luke was washing mud from a horse bridle. His hair, uncut all winter, was long and shaggy, falling into his eyes as he worked. Clara sat watching him. She had been mending one of Samuel's small shirts. She put the needlework down. "Your hair," she said, her voice quiet. He looked up, pushing the dark strands back with a wet hand. "It's in your eyes," she said, a faint flush on her cheeks. "I could, if you have shears, I could cut it." He stopped his work. This was different. This was a request, an offer of touch. He looked at her hands, which were now clean and strong, no longer the raw, chapped claws of the winter. He gave a single, slow nod. He retrieved the sheep shears from his saddlebag, and a small, cracked mirror. He sat on a fallen log, his back to her. He felt her small, hesitant movements as she stood behind him. He heard the snick-snick of the shears. Her fingers, light as moth wings, brushed his neck, lifting the hair. Every touch was a small jolt. He sat rigid, his hands gripping his knees. He was used to violence, to cold, to solitude. This gentle, domestic touch was a new kind of pain, a sweet ache that tightened his chest. She worked for a long time, her breathing soft, her movements growing more confident. "There," she said finally. "I think you should look." She moved to stand in front of him, holding the small mirror up. He didn't look at the mirror. His eyes never left her face. She was standing close, her arm raised. She was biting her lower lip, a small frown of concentration on her face. As she studied her own work, she looked, in that moment, entirely beautiful. "It's better," she said, her voice faltering under his intense, silent gaze. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She met his eyes, and the air between them grew thick, just as it had the night he'd held her frozen hands. She took a small step back, her foot landing on a patch of wet clay by the riverbank. She slipped. It was not a bad fall, but he moved with the speed of a snake. He dropped the bridle and shot forward, his hands a blur. He caught her before she could hit the ground, his hands locking on her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. She gasped, her hands landing on his shoulders. Her wet foot slid, bringing her even closer. They were face to face, heart to heart. He could feel the small, quick puffs of her breath against his mouth. He could see the startled, dark blue of her eyes, the faint freckles across her nose. The smell of her, clean soap and sun on her hair, filled his senses. The world stopped. The river, the wind, the cry of a hawk overhead, it all faded. There was only the hard pound of his heart against her ribs, the solid grip of his hands on her waist. He wanted to lower his head. He wanted to taste her mouth. He saw her eyes flicker, her lips part. And then, the moment broke. The shame, the fear of being seen, the habit of 100 slights flooded back into her. She flushed a deep, painful red and pulled back, her hands pushing against his shoulders. I'm sorry, I slipped. Luke's hands, which had been gripping her like she was the only solid thing on earth, loosened. He let her go, but his hands were slow to leave her. He watched her scramble back, straightening her dress, her hair falling over her face. She wouldn't look at him. "Clara," he started. "I have to check Samuel," she said, her voice high and tight. She turned and hurried to the blanket, fussing over the sleeping child. Luke stood, his body tight as a coiled rope. He picked up the mirror from the mud. He'd done his best to shield her from the town, but he saw now that the town was inside her. It lived in her shame, in the way she flinched from a simple touch, and it made him hate. The town had noticed the spring thaw, too. They noticed the new garden. They noticed the repaired roof. They saw Luke's horse tied outside the shack not just for an hour, but for a day. They saw Clara, wearing a new coat, her face no longer hollow with hunger, but soft. They saw the laughter by the woodpile, and they despised her for it. She was not just a sinner, she was a rewarded sinner. The spite, which had been confined to whispers, turned to action. It happened late one evening. Luke had ridden to his own cabin to check his stock, planning to return in the morning. Clara was alone, nursing Samuel by the last light. A rock, the size of a man's fist, crashed through the window Luke had so carefully mended. Glass exploded across the room. Clara screamed, covering Samuel with her body, rolling off the cot onto the dirt floor. She lay there, her heart hammering, her ears ringing. She heard a man's laughter, coarse and drunken. From the darkness, "There's more for you, harlot." Another rock hit the door with a thud. She lay in the dark, clutching her child, for hours. She didn't light a lamp. She didn't move. She just shook, the cold air from the broken window settling over her like a shroud. When Luke returned at dawn, he found her like that, huddled on the floor, her eyes wide and vacant with terror. He saw the glass. He saw the rock. A cold, killing rage settled in his chest. He said nothing. He found a piece of canvas and nailed it over the broken window. He rebuilt the fire. He made her drink hot coffee, but his face was a mask, his eyes flat and gray. He rode into town. He tied his horse outside his stable room. Nailed to the wooden door was a crude, folded piece of paper. He ripped it free. The words were scrawled in charcoal. "You'll regret her." It was the same warning from the pastor, from the saloon. It was the town's final judgment. He crumpled the note in his fist and went to the rusted spur. The saloon was quiet. It was too early for drifters. Just the usual men avoiding work. Silas Croft, the blacksmith, was at the bar, nursing a beer. He saw Luke enter, saw the look on his face, and gave a mean, knowing grin. "Morning, Mallory," Silas called out, his voice loud in the room. "Heard you had some trouble down by the river. Must be hard, keeping that kind of woman satisfied. Heard she's used to finer things." Luke didn't stop. He didn't slow. He walked straight to the bar. "I hear," Silas continued, emboldened by Luke's silence. That Finch got tired of her. So she's moved on. You just warming his bed? Mallory? Eating Finch's leavings? Luke's fist was a single, hard sound. It connected with Silas's mouth with the crack of a splitting log. It wasn't a saloon brawl. It was an execution. Silas was unconscious before he hit the floor, two of his front teeth skittering across the boards. The room went dead silent. The barman stared, his hand frozen on a glass. Luke stood over the blacksmith, his chest heaving. The ghosts of that brothel in Cheyenne were swirling around him, the smell of blood and whiskey. He'd done it again. He'd let his rage take over in a fight that wasn't his. But this time, it felt right. It felt clean. He turned and walked out. Sheriff Brody was on him before he reached his horse. "Luke! Damn it! Luke! What did you do?" "He insulted her," Luke said, his voice a low growl. He was still clenching the crumpled note. "I don't care if he insulted your mother. You can't just walk into a public house and nearly kill him. Silas is spitting blood and teeth. I warned you. Luke, I warned you to stay away." He threw a rock through her window. Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You think he did? You don't know. Luke, I'm on your side here, but I can't. The council, Old Man Finch. Look, you're on thin ice. It's so thin, you're already in the water. Get out of town. Go to your cabin. Do not come back for a few days. Let this cool off, or I swear to God, I will have to lock you up." Luke stared at the sheriff, his anger warring with the cold. Hard logic. He gave a sharp nod, unhitched his horse, and rode. He didn't ride west to his cabin. He rode south to the river. He found Clara sweeping up the last of the glass. She was pale, her hands shaking. He walked in, his knuckles split and bloody from the fight. She saw his hand. "Luke, what happened?" "Pack your things," he said, his voice rough. He didn't answer her. He went to the cot and started gathering her few belongings, tossing them onto her blanket. "Pack Samuel's things. You're leaving." She stared, confused and frightened. "Leaving? Leaving where?" "My cabin. You're not safe here. You and the boy are moving in with me." The color drained from her face. She stopped sweeping and stood frozen, the broom in her hand. "No." He stopped, the blanket in his fist. "No? What do you mean, no? Did you not hear me? They're throwing rocks. Clara, they're trying to hurt you. And what do you think they'll do if I move in with you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a new, stronger emotion. It wasn't fear, it was shame. "What do you think they'll say then?" "I don't give a damn what they say," he exploded. "I do," she cried, her voice breaking. I'll be your whore. That's what they'll call me. That's what I'll be. I'm already ruined. I won't be your ruin, Luke." The word hit him like a physical blow. Ruin. The pastor's word. The sheriff's word. And now, hers. He stood there for a long, silent moment. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a deep, hollow ache. He let the blanket fall from his hand. He crossed the small room in 2 strides. She flinched, thinking his anger was for her, but he stopped in front of her. He was very gentle. He raised his bloody, calloused hand. Not to strike, but to touch. He laid his fingers against her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't known she'd shed. "Clara," he said, his voice now quiet, but vibrating with an intensity that shook her to the core. "Look at me." She raised her eyes, swimming with tears. To his, "You are not my ruin," he said. "You're my reason. You're the first thing that's made sense in 5 years. You're my reason, not my ruin." She stared at him, her heart stopping. No one had ever spoken to her like that. She saw in his eyes that he meant it. But the shame was too old, too deep. She was a good woman, and good women did not live with men who were not their husbands. She shook her head, a small, agonizing movement. "I can't. Please, don't ask me to." Luke's face hardened. He looked at her, at the stubborn, frightened set of her jaw. He saw that he couldn't win this. Not today. He dropped his hand from her face. Without another word, he turned, walked out of the shack, and rode west to his cabin. Alone. The storm hit just after midnight. It wasn't a spring shower. It was a Wyoming tantrum. The sky ripped open, dumping sheets of cold rain. The wind howled, a high, demonic scream. Lightning flashed, one strike after another, illuminating the plains in terrifying, white-blue snapshots. Luke was at his cabin. He couldn't sleep. He stood by his window, a cup of coffee long gone cold in his hand, watching the storm and thinking of her, alone in that flimsy shack by the rising river. He'd left his anger behind and now felt only a cold, gnawing dread. Clara was terrified. The canvas he'd nailed over the window snapped and whipped in the wind. The river was a roar. Samuel was crying, his wails lost in the thunder. And then she heard it, a sound that wasn't the storm, a heavy, drunken pounding on her new, solid door. Boom! 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 "Clara, open up, girl," a man's voice slurred. "I know you're in there. Mallory ain't here to protect you tonight." She froze. Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't Silas. It was one of his friends, a drifter she'd seen at the saloon. Boom! Boom! "Open up, or I'll break it down." "A girl like you shouldn't be alone on a night like this," the door groaned. He was putting his shoulder to it. The bar Luke had placed inside was the only thing holding it. She didn't think. She snatched Samuel from his box, grabbed the one blanket Luke had left her, and ran to the back wall. She tore at the sod and planks Luke had used to patch it, creating a small, muddy hole. She crawled out into the driving, horizontal rain, clutching her baby. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, only away. She ran into the teeth of the storm, through mud that sucked at her boots, across the open prairie. The lightning was her only guide. She ran toward the one place she knew she would be safe. She ran west. It was miles. She fell, her knees and hands ripped open by the rocky soil. She held Samuel inside her coat, his small body her only warmth. She was sobbing, blinded by rain and terror. She finally saw the light. A single, yellow square in the blackness. Luke's cabin. She used the last of her strength to stumble up to the door, pounding on it with her small, muddy fist. The door was ripped open. Luke stood there, his shirt off, a gun in his hand. He'd been about to ride out for her. He saw her, soaked, covered in mud, hyperventilating. "Clara!" He tried. She gasped, falling into him. A man. He tried to get in. He tried. He swept her inside in one motion, kicking the door shut and dropping the heavy bar. He took the crying, wet child from her. He stripped the boy's wet things and wrapped him in a dry towel, placing him in a box near the hearth. Clara just stood in the middle of the floor, shaking so violently her teeth rattled. She was in a daze, past terror, past exhaustion. "Clara," Luke said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're soaked to the bone. You have to get out of that dress." She just stared at him, uncomprehending. He took her by the shoulders and sat her in the chair by the fire. Her fingers were white and numb. She couldn't have undone a button if her life depended on it. He knelt in front of her. "I'm going to take it off," he said, his voice low. She nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. He worked at the small buttons on the front of her dress. His large, rough fingers, which had been split and bloody hours before, were surprisingly deft. He unhooked the front. The wet canvas fell open. He turned her, his touch impersonal, and unlaced the back. He slid the dress from her shoulders, down her arms. It fell in a heavy, sodden pile at her feet. She sat before him in her thin, white chemise. It was soaked, clinging to her ribs, to her breasts, to the flat of her belly. She was so thin. Luke swallowed, his throat dry. He stood, grabbed the heaviest wool blanket from his bed, and wrapped it tight around her, cocooning her. He chafed her hands, her arms, trying to force the life back into her. He poured a heavy dose of whiskey into a tin cup and pressed it to her lips. "Drink." She drank. It burned, but it stopped the shaking. He built the fire up until it roared, a wall of heat against the storm. The tension in the small, warm room was a living thing. It was thick with the smell of the storm, of wet wool, and of their close, shared fear. She sat, wrapped in his blanket, her dark hair streaming water onto the floor. He stood by the fire, watching her. His anger was a white-hot coal in his chest, an anger at the drifter, at the town, at himself for leaving her. She looked at him. His chest was bare, his skin gleaming in the firelight. He was strength. He was safety. He was the man who had called her his reason. "Luke," she whispered. Her voice was just a breath. He crossed the space between them. He knelt before her chair again, putting him at her level. He looked into her eyes, searching her face. He didn't... "No," she whispered. "I ran." He closed his eyes in relief. He reached up, his hand going to her face again, his thumb brushing the mud from her cheek. And then he kissed her. It was not the chaste, desperate kiss by the river. It was a kiss born of the storm. It was rough and deep and desperate. It was all the anger he felt and all the fear she'd survived. It was the nearly from the riverbank, the tension from the lamp, the gratitude from the fever, all crashing together. He tasted of whiskey and smoke, and he was the warmest thing she had ever known. He poured all his unspoken words into it, all his guilt over Ethan, all his rage at the town. Clara, who had been frozen, melted. She responded, her hand coming up to tangle in his damp hair. She kissed him back with a matching, desperate hunger. This was not submission. This was a choice. This was her answer. He broke the kiss, pulling back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was ragged. He was shaking. "Clara!" he rasped, his voice thick. "Are you sure?" He was giving her the out, the choice, the one thing Harlan Finch had stolen from her. She looked at him, her eyes clear, dark, and deep in the firelight. There was no fear in them. Not anymore. She didn't speak. She put her small, cold hand on the back of his warm, strong neck, and she pulled him close. He lifted her from the chair, the blanket still wrapped around her, and carried her the few steps to his bed. He laid her down and followed, covering them both. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was only the sound of the fire and their breathing. It was not a violent coupling. It was a healing. For Luke, it was the first time in 5 years he had touched another human being with tenderness. The first time he had allowed himself to feel anything but guilt and anger. He was slow and careful and desperate to show her what touch was supposed to feel like. For Clara, it was a reclaiming. Every touch, every kiss, every gentle pressure of his hands on her body was wiping away the memory of Harlan Finch. He wasn't taking, he was asking, he was giving. He was making her feel, not dirty, not used, but wanted, cherished. When it was over, the storm had passed, leaving only the sound of a steady, gentle rain on the roof. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Samuel was asleep, safe in his box. Clara lay with her head on Luke's chest, his arm a heavy, protective weight across her waist. She had never felt so safe, so anchored. She listened to the slow, steady beat of his heart under her ear. She let out a long, shuddering breath. Tears she hadn't known were left began to slip, quiet and hot, from her eyes, falling onto his skin. "I didn't think," she whispered, her voice muffled against him. "I didn't think I'd ever feel clean again." Luke went very still. He held her tighter, his fingers stroking her damp hair. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You're not the dirty one," he said, his voice a low, rough growl in the darkness. "You never were." The morning after the storm was quiet, the air washed clean. The world, for Clara, had been remade, lying in Luke's bed, safe, with her son sleeping by the fire. She had felt the ice of her shame finally begin to crack. She did not return to the shack by the river. It was understood, without words, that she would stay. That flimsy, broken lean-to was a tomb, and she had been resurrected from it. She was here, in Luke's cabin, and she was, for the first time in over a year, safe, but Luke was a man who understood the land. His cabin was a bachelor's space, built for one. It was solid, but it was small, and he was a man who understood pride. He knew that for Clara to truly heal, she needed more than his protection. She needed a home, a place that was hers, built not in desperation but with intention. He began the very next day. He chose a spot 100 yards from his own cabin, on a gentle rise that caught the morning sun. It was sheltered by a stand of tall pines and looked out over the wide, greening prairie. "A man needs a place to work," he told her, gesturing to his own cabin. "And a family needs a home." He rode to the lumber mill, the one outside town, far from the main street. He paid cash, hard coin, for good, seasoned pine, for cedar shakes for the roof, and for 2 glass windows. He spent nearly all the money he'd saved from the cattle drive. He hauled it back himself, his wagon groaning under the weight. The work consumed him, from sunup to sundown. The sounds of his labor echoed across the small valley, the thud of the axe as he felled trees for the foundation posts, the clean thwack of his hammer, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat, the long, whispery shh of the plain. He was building a house. It was a proper cabin, with 2 rooms, a main room for living and cooking, and a separate room for sleeping. A real floor, not just packed earth. A porch. At first, Clara watched from a distance, holding Samuel, her heart tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It was joy, but it was so new, so fragile, that she was afraid to breathe on it. It felt undeserved, but she couldn't just watch. She had spent her life working. She started small. She would bring him water from the well. She made him lunches of bread and salt pork, which they ate sitting on the stacks of new lumber, the air smelling of fresh-cut pine. Then she began to help. She was strong, her hands deft. She learned to hold the planks steady while he nailed them. She chinked the logs, mixing the mud and straw herself, pressing it into the gaps with a fierce, protective energy. She was not just helping him build a house, she was building a fortress. Luke watched her. He saw the color return to her cheeks, the strength come back to her limbs. He saw the way her eyes lit up when he finished the frame for the first window. One afternoon, she was handing him shingles as he worked on the roof. He paused, his hammer in hand, and just looked at her. She was smiling, her face smudged with dirt, her hair loose in the breeze. It was the first time he'd seen her truly, fully smile, without fear, without shame. "What is it?" she asked, her smile faltering. Worried she'd done something wrong. "Nothing," he said, his voice rough. "You're just good to look at." The simple, honest words made her blush a deep, painful red. But this time, it was not the blush of shame. It was the blush of pleasure. She ducked her head, but she was still smiling. In Laramie Fork, news of Silas Croft's broken teeth had traveled fast, but the news that followed traveled faster, and with more venom. Luke Mallory hadn't just beaten a man for insulting his whore. He was building her a house, on his land, a proper house with glass windows. It was an outrage. It was a slap in the face to every decent, God-fearing family in the territory. He wasn't just sinning. He was celebrating his sin. He was building a monument to it. On Sunday, Pastor Miles took to his pulpit, his face pale with righteousness. He did not name them, but he didn't have to. "There is a cancer in our midst," he thundered, his bony fist striking the lectern. "A rot that we have allowed to fester. We have been tolerant, we have been patient, but our tolerance has been mistaken for weakness. The sinner has grown bold. He flaunts his vice, builds a temple to his shame, and invites the devil to sit at his table, right here in our own community." He spoke of Sodom. He spoke of fire and brimstone. He spoke of the sacred bonds of marriage, and the filth of the woman who would break it, and the moral weakness of the man who would wallow with her. The congregation sat rigid. The women looked at the floor, their faces hard. The men stared at the pastor, their own righteous anger being stoked. After the service, a group of them gathered outside, their voices low and grim. Mr. Finch, Harlan's father, was among them, his face like a thundercloud. "This is an affront," Finch said, his voice a low rumble. That woman brought shame to my family. And now this cowboy, this drifter, Mallory. He gives her a home. It's an endorsement of her lies. It spits on my son's good name. The pastor is right, another man agreed. It's a stain on the town. What will people say? Who passed through here? They found Luke at the church. He had not come for the service. He had come to the small cemetery behind it, a patch of windswept ground. He was standing, hat in hand, over a simple wooden cross. There was no name on it, just a date, 5 years gone. Ethan? He was paying his respects, as he did every few months, his guilt a heavy, familiar coat. Mallory? He turned. 6 of them. Pastor Miles, Mr. Finch, and 4 other ranchers and merchants. They stood in a line, like a jury. Gentlemen, Luke said, his voice flat. He put his hat back on. We are here, Pastor Miles said, stepping forward, as a delegation from the good people of this town, to ask you to cease this madness. I'm not sure I take your meaning, Pastor. You know full well. Mr. Finch snapped. This house you are building, for her, he spat the word. It is an offense. You are harboring a woman of low character, a liar, and a harlot. Luke's eyes went cold. He looked from Finch to the pastor. I'm building a home for a woman and her child, who nearly froze to death while this town, and you, pastor, watched. She brought it on herself, one of the merchants said. She's a fallen woman. We are asking you, Mr. Mallory, the pastor said, his voice trembling with fervor, to send her away. Send her back where she came from. Give her passage on a stage, but purge her from this community. For the good of all, if you refuse, you will no longer be welcome here. Your credit will be cut. Your beef will not be bought. You will be an outcast, as she is. Luke looked at the 6 faces, twisted with their sour, pious anger. He saw their fear that one act of kindness, one act of defiance, could unravel the tight, judgmental rules they lived by. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim low. She stays, he said, his voice quiet. You'll regret this, the pastor cried, his face turning red. You are choosing her over God. No, pastor, Luke said, his voice hard. He turned and walked past them, his shoulders set. I'm choosing her over you. Clara had needed supplies. Flour, sugar, more coffee. With a new, brave confidence. She had harnessed Luke's wagon, bundled up Samuel, and driven into town. She had not gone to the general store. She went to the smaller mercantile on the edge of town, hoping to be in and out. She was tying the wagon when she heard them. She was in the alley, and they were on the boardwalk, just turning the corner. The pastor's voice, still high with anger from the confrontation with Luke. The man's arrogance. She stays. He says, as if he's a king. He's a fool. Mister. Finch's voice rumbled. A rutting animal, led by his base urges. He's no better than the trash he's protecting. He'll regret it, another voice said. He'll be ruined. No one will trade with him. No one will speak to him. All for her. It's a joke. What does he see in her? Finch sneered. She's nothing. Used goods. My son Harlan. He told me she threw herself at him. Begged him. And when he refused her, she ran off, pregnant by God knows who, and tried to blame him. And now Mallory, he's stuck with her. He's building a house for another man's leavings. He'll be the laughingstock of the territory. Clara stood frozen in the alley, her hand on the wagon. The sack of flour felt like a ton of lead. Used goods. Another man's leavings. Laughingstock. Every word was a nail, crucifying her. The joy she had felt, the warmth, the feeling of being clean, it all evaporated. The shame, which had only been sleeping, came roaring back. A cold, black tide. She wasn't his reason. She was his ruin, just as she had always feared. The men were right. The pastor was right. She was a stain, and she was spreading that stain to him. He was a good man. He had saved her. He had saved Samuel, and in return, she was destroying his life. She didn't buy the flour. She climbed back onto the wagon, her movements wooden, and drove back to the cabin. The prairie, which had looked green and full of promise, now looked empty and gray. She found Luke by the half-built house, his anger from the confrontation still radiating from him like a hot stove. "I need to check the traps," he said. His voice clipped. He grabbed his rifle and stalked off into the trees, needing to be alone, needing to cool his rage. Clara watched him go, and she knew what she had to do. She went into his cabin. She found the old, worn saddlebag she had arrived with. It contained nothing. She began to pack her spare dress, the one Luke had bought her, Samuel's few rags, the small, carved wooden bird Luke had whittled for the boy. She wrapped Samuel in his blanket. She looked around the small, warm cabin. It had been her sanctuary. She looked at the new house, its ribs bare, a skeleton of a dream. She wrote a note, her hand shaking so badly the words were nearly illegible. "You are a good man. I will not be your ruin." She put the note on his pillow, turned, and walked out. She didn't know where she was going. Back to the shack, maybe, or just walk until she and Samuel were just dust on the wind. She just knew she had to leave. Luke was gone for an hour. His anger cooled with the walking, but the dread remained. He returned, empty-handed, his mind on the coming fight. He saw the cabin door was open. "Clara?" Silence. He saw the wagon was gone. A cold fist closed around his heart. He ran into the cabin. "Clara!" The room was empty. Samuel's box was empty. He saw the note on his bed. He read the 6 words, "I will not be your ruin." His rage returned, but it was not at the town. It was a hot, terrifying rage born of pure fear. He ran from the cabin, scanning the prairie. He saw the wagon, a small speck, a mile east, heading not toward town, but toward the open, empty plains. He didn't saddle his horse. He just ran, his long legs eating the ground, his mind a black storm. He cut across the low hills, using his knowledge of the land to intercept her. He caught her at the dry creek bed. He came up over the rise and stood in the middle of the path, his chest heaving. Clara saw him. She pulled the mule to a halt, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. "Get down," he said. His voice was not a request. "Luke, please, let me go. It's for the best. Get down." He strode to the wagon and lifted her, his hands gripping her waist, and set her on the ground as if she weighed nothing. He was furious. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, shaking growl. "Running? Where were you going? To freeze in a ditch? To starve?" "I'm saving you," she cried, her voice finally breaking, the tears coming. "Don't you understand? They hate you because of me. They're going to ruin you. Mr. Finch, the pastor, they said... She choked on the words. "They said I was your shame, that you're a laughingstock. And they're right." "They're right?" he roared, his fury making her flinch. "You think I care what those hypocrites say? You think their words mean anything to me? I've been in this town for 7 years, and I haven't cared what a single one of them thinks. You think I'm going to start now?" "But it's true," she sobbed, her fists clenched at her sides. "I'm not clean. I'm not good. I'm what they say I am. And I'm making you the same. I won't do it. I won't be your shame." He stared at her, at the raw, agonizing guilt on her face. He saw that his anger was only frightening her, confirming her fears. His fury broke, like a fever. It left him empty and aching. He reached for her, and she flinched. He stopped, slowly, gently. He took her trembling hands in his. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping, breaking with an emotion she had never heard from him. "Look at me." She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dust. He dropped to one knee. In the mud of the creek bed, this tall, proud, angry man knelt before her. He held her hands. He lifted them to his lips and kissed her knuckles. His own eyes closed tight. "You are not my shame," he whispered against her skin. "You are my heart." He released one of her hands and touched her, his hand moving with a reverence that stopped her breath. He touched her stomach, his palm flat against her, where Samuel had grown. "This is not shame," he murmured. He touched the faint, pale scar on her wrist. "The one from Harlan Finch. This is not your shame," he said, his voice growing thick. "It's his." He took her hands again, holding them tight, and pressed his forehead against them. "My life was nothing. It was empty. It was a room with no windows, and I was just sitting in it, waiting to die. Because of Ethan." He was admitting his deepest wound. "And then I saw you, barefoot in the snow, and you were the first thing that made me want to fight for something, to build something." He looked up at her, his gray eyes raw, vulnerable, stripped of all their defenses. "You leave me, that is what will ruin me. You are the only thing I have that isn't a ghost. If I lose you, Clara, that's what I'll regret. Nothing else, only that." She was sobbing, but they were not the tears of shame. They were the tears of a heart that was breaking and healing, all at once. He stood, pulling her into his arms. He held her, his face buried in her hair, his whole body trembling. "Don't you ever," he whispered, his voice fierce, "run from me again. We stay. We fight. Together." She clutched him, her arms locked around his neck. "I'll stay," she whispered. "I'll stay." She stayed, but the fight had just begun. A week later, the new cabin had walls and a roof. They were working together, living together. A small, defiant island of peace in a sea of hostility. And then he returned. Harlan Finch. He rode into town not as a disgraced son, but as a changed man. His wife, the woman from Cheyenne, had died in childbirth. He was a widower, dressed in expensive black. And he had heard the news. He'd heard that his whore, the girl his father had run off, was back. And she had a son. He did not come to the cabin. He went to the law. Sheriff Brody rode out to Luke's land, his face grim. He found Luke and Clara splitting wood by the new cabin. "Luke, ma'am." He nodded to Clara, his expression uneasy. I have to serve these papers." He handed Luke a folded document. Luke's face was grim as he read it. "What is it?" Clara asked, her hand flying to her throat. "It's from Harlan Finch," Luke said, his voice flat. "He's petitioning the circuit judge. He's claiming paternity. He's suing for custody of Samuel." Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the woodpile, the world tilting. "What? No, he can't. He ran me off." "His story is different, ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice full of pity. "He's claiming you seduced him, that he was a young, foolish man, and you were experienced. He says when you found out you were pregnant, you tried to blackmail him, and when he refused, you ran to shame him. He's saying he's a widower now, a God-fearing man, and he wants to rescue his blood son from a life of sin and poverty." "That's a lie," Clara screamed, jumping to her feet. "He's lying. He hurt me. He forced me." "I know, ma'am. I suspect I know," Brody said, twisting his hat in his hands. "But the problem is, Judge Harlan is in Finch's pocket. Old man Finch has half this county bought and paid for. And Harlan is rich. He's respectable. And you," he looked at her, his eyes sad, "you're living with a man who's not your husband. The judge will see that. He'll see Harlan as the fit parent. So we just let him take him," Luke said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "No, we fight," Brody said. "But we need witnesses. We need proof. Harlan's word against Clara's. She'll lose. But if we can find someone who will testify, someone who saw her that night, someone she told, someone who can speak to her character, or his." Clara was pale as death. "There's no one. They all believed him. Mrs. Finch, she threw me out." "What about Doc Evans?" Luke said, his mind racing. "She gave birth in his barn. He saw her." "I don't know," Brody said, shaking his head. "Doc Evans values his peace, and he values his practice. Crossing the Finches is a big risk. I'll talk to him. But you You need to be prepared. The hearing is in 3 days, when the judge arrives." Clara panicked. After the sheriff left, she fell apart. She grabbed Samuel, holding him so tight he cried. "They can't take him. Luke, they can't. He's all I have. He's all that's mine. I'll die. I'll kill him. I'll kill myself before I let that man put his hands on my son." "Hush," Luke said, his voice fierce, gripping her shoulders. "No one is taking him. I will find a witness. I will talk to Doc Evans myself. I will tear this town apart. No one is taking your son." Luke rode into town like a storm. He went straight to Doc Evans. He found the old man mixing remedies in his office. "Doc," Luke said, wasting no time. "Finch is trying to take her boy." Doc Evans stopped stirring. He didn't look up. "I heard. The sheriff said you saw her. After she ran. She was in your barn." "She was," the doctor said, his voice quiet. "You have to testify," Luke said. "You have to tell the judge what you saw. Her bruises, her fever, that she was alone." The doctor set his pestle down. He looked at Luke, his eyes ancient and tired. "Luke, I'm an old man. The Finches. They own the bank. The bank holds the note on this building. They are on the town council that approves my license. If I testify against Harlan Finch, I lose everything. My practice, my home. I'll be on the street." Just like she was. "And you'll let him take her baby? After what you did for her? After you saved her?" "I saved her because she was a patient in front of me," the doctor said, his voice pained. This is different. This is politics. This is power. I'm sorry, Luke. I can't." Luke stared at the doctor, his disgust a cold, bitter taste. He saw not an evil man, but a weak one, a coward. He turned. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped, and slammed the door on his way out. He had no one. It was their word against Finch's. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She paced the new cabin, which was almost finished but now felt like a trap. Luke was out, checking his perimeter, his rifle in his hand. He was too agitated to be still. Clara felt an urge. She needed something. A small tin locket her mother had given her. It had been in her saddlebag, the one she'd left at the old shack. She hadn't thought of it in months. Now, it was the only thing she could think of, a piece of her old, clean life. She thought Luke was far off. She thought she would be quick. She slipped out, running through the darkness, back to the river, back to the ruin. The door was off its hinges. The shack was dark, smelling of rot and river mud. She felt her way to the corner where her bag had been. Looking for this, a match scraped. A lantern flared. Harlan Finch was sitting on a crate, not 10 feet away, blocking the door. He was smiling, and in his hand, dangling from its chain, was her locket. Clara screamed. It was a high, thin sound of pure animal terror. "You've been a hard girl to find, Clara," he said, his voice a soft, polite drawl that made her skin crawl. "Living in a new house, living with him? You've improved your station?" She backed away, hitting the wall. "Get away from me." "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you," he said, standing up. He was taller than she remembered, dressed in his fine black coat. "I'm your savior. I'm here to take you away from all this. You and my son." He stepped toward her. "You'll testify," he whispered, his smile gone. "You'll tell the judge you lied. You'll say you want me to have the boy, that you're unfit. And if you don't..." He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting in, just as they had that night. "I'll tell them what you are. I'll tell them how you begged for it. And Luke, he'll believe me. They all will." "No!" she screamed, twisting, clawing at his face. She heard a sound, a low, animal growl. Harlan's head snapped toward the door. Luke was standing there, his rifle leveled, his face a white mask of killing rage. He had heard her scream. "Get your hands," Luke said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Off her." Harlan let go, his hands flying up. Mallory, this is just a misunderstanding. She came here to meet me. Luke, Clara sobbed, running behind him, clutching his shirt. Luke didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on Finch. I should kill you, Luke whispered, the rifle not wavering. I should kill you and bury you under this shack, and no one would ever know. You can't, Harlan stammered, his arrogance gone, his eyes wide on the gun. It's murder. You'll hang. Maybe, Luke said, but he still won't touch you. He won't touch Samuel. He won't ever touch you again. He raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel. Luke, no! Clara screamed, grabbing his arm. Don't! Not for him! Not for me! Don't! Luke looked at her terrified face. He looked at Finch, who was sweating in the cold. He lowered the rifle just an inch. Get out, he growled. You'll be in that courtroom in 3 days, because I'm going to destroy you. But if you ever come near her again, if you ever speak her name outside of that room, I will find you, and I will finish this. Now, run! Harlan Finch didn't need to be told twice. He bolted past them, out of the shack, and disappeared into the darkness. Luke stood, shaking, his breath coming hard. He dropped the rifle and pulled Clara into his arms. She was trembling so hard she couldn't stand. He held her, his vow a low, brutal promise against her hair. He won't touch you again. The 3 days that followed were a cold war. The encounter in the shack had been a private terror. The confrontation in the saloon was a public declaration. Luke did not wait. He rode into town the next morning, the sun barely over the plains, his face a mask of cold iron. He left his horse in the street and walked into the rusted spur. It was early, but the place was already occupied. Harlan Finch was at a table near the back, his father beside him, along with 2 other ranchers from the council. They were drinking coffee, not whiskey, plotting their legal victory. Luke's entrance cut the murmuring short. The barman froze, his hand on a glass. Luke walked, his steps measured. His spurs the only sound, a slow, metallic ching. Ching, ching. He did not stop at the bar. He walked straight to Harlan's table. Harlan looked up, his face a mixture of fear and bravado. Mallory, he sneered, trying to sound dismissive. I told you last night. You, Luke said, his voice a low, flat growl that cut through the room, will shut your mouth. He placed both hands, palms down, on their table. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on Harlan, ignoring the others. I am only going to say this one time, in front of witnesses, Luke said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner. You threatened her last night. You put your hands on her. That's a lie, Harlan's father blustered. Starting to rise, Luke's eyes snapped to the older man, and his gaze was so full of violence that Finch sat back down. Luke turned back to Harlan. The court date is on Tuesday. You will be there. You will sit. You will listen to her. And when it is over, you will leave this town. If you are not in that courtroom, I will find you. If you lose and you stay, I will find you. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only the table could hear, but the intensity of which the whole room could feel. If you ever, for the rest of your life, come within 100 miles of her, or that boy, I will kill you. I don't care if it's in a church. I don't care if it's in the street. I will kill you, and I will not lose a night's sleep over it. He straightened up, his voice rising again for the room. There are no misunderstandings. There is just this. He stays away, or I put him in the ground. Sheriff, Old Man Finch roared, his face purple. Sheriff Brody, are you going to let this man threaten my son? Arrest him. Sheriff Brody was sitting at a table in the corner, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He hadn't moved. He looked at Finch, then at Luke. He hasn't drawn a weapon. Mr. Finch, Brody said, his voice tired. He hasn't broken a law. He's just expressing his opinion. This is a private matter, to be settled by the judge. Luke held Harlan's gaze for one more long, cold second. Then he turned, his back to the room, and walked out. The batwing doors swung shut behind him. The saloon exploded in sound. The showdown was no longer a secret. It was a war, declared in the town's public square. Laramie Fork was split down the middle. The established, respectable families, the merchants, the councilmen, the pastor's flock were outraged. Luke Mallory was white trash, a drifter who'd gotten lucky with some land. He was an ungodly man, consorting with a harlot, and now he had threatened the life of a prominent citizen. They wanted him and the woman gone. They wanted them exiled, their new cabin burned, the land purged of their sin. But there was another side, a quieter side. The miners who came down from the hills, who'd been squeezed by Finch's bank. The ranch hands who knew Harlan's reputation for arrogance. The washerwomen and stable boys who had seen Clara in the snow. Who knew what desperation looked like. They saw Luke as the only man in town with any grit. Support came in strange ways. As Luke was buying supplies, preparing to hole up in his cabin until the trial, he found an extra sack of oats tied to his wagon. He'd find a brace of rabbits, skinned and cleaned, left on his porch. One afternoon, a woman he'd never seen before, a rancher's wife, rode past their land. She stopped her horse, looked at Clara, who was hanging laundry, and gave a single, respectful nod. The town was holding its breath. Tuesday, everything depended on Tuesday. The new cabin was finished, but it offered no peace. It felt like a fortress under siege. The night before the trial, the air was thick with dread. Samuel was asleep, but Clara couldn't be still. She paced the new pine floor, her hands twisting in her dress. "I can't do it, Luke," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of panic. "I'll stand up. He'll be there, his father, all of them. They'll look at me, the pastor, the women. They'll all be thinking that I'm what he said." Her breathing grew shallow. "The words, they won't come out. I'll just stand there and they'll give him Samuel. They'll just take him." Luke sat at the table, his face carved from shadows in the lamplight. He'd been cleaning his rifle, but he set it aside. He pulled out the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. It was a command, but his voice was quiet. She sat, her hands shaking so badly she hid them in her lap. He put a single piece of paper on the table, and a pencil. "You're right. You'll be scared. You'll forget, so we're going to write it down. We're going to write every last word. I can't." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. He pushed the pencil toward her. "You're going to tell it to me, and then you're going to write it. And tomorrow, you're not going to talk to them. You're just going to read the words on the paper. You can do that." She picked up the pencil, her knuckles white. "Start at the beginning," he said. "Start with the kitchen." Her first breath was a choked sob. I was scrubbing the floor. "Write that," he said. She wrote, her hand shaking. "He came in," she whispered, her eyes seeing not the cabin, but that room, that night. "He smelled of whiskey and cigars." "Write it," Luke said, his voice a low growl. His own hands were clenched into fists on the table. She told him. She told him every detail she had locked away, the feel of the rough flour sacks at her back, the sound of his laugh, the pain in her wrist, his hand, heavy and suffocating, over her mouth. "And then," she whispered, the tears now flowing hot and silent, He fixed his collar, and he told me to be smart, and he left." "Write it down," Luke said, his voice thick with a murderous rage. "Write down every word he said." She wrote. She told him about Mrs. Finch, her eyes cold as ice, calling her a liar. She told him about being thrown out with no coat. She told him about the barn. "Tell me about the barn," Luke commanded, his gaze fixed on her. "It was so cold," she cried, rocking in her chair. The cow, it just watched me. When Samuel came, he didn't cry. I thought he was dead. I had to—" "Say it, Clara." I bit the cord. She sobbed. Like an animal, I bit it, and I wrapped him in my shawl, and I lay down in the straw, and I prayed for us to die. Write that, Luke said, his voice raw. Write that, and let the judge read it. Let them all read it. They worked through the night. When the first gray light of dawn touched the window, the paper was full, front and back, with her small, cramped handwriting. She was pale, exhausted, hollowed out, but the wild panic was gone. The hysteria had been burned away, leaving only the cold, hard ash of the truth. She had faced it. She had written it. Now, she just had to read it. The trial was held in the town hall, which also served as the church and the meeting house. By 9 in the morning, it was packed. Every seat was taken. People stood 3 deep along the back wall. The air was hot and smelled of sweat and soap and suspense. Clara and Luke sat on a bench at the front. Luke was in his trail clothes, his gun belt unbuckled, the holster empty, as required by the court. But he was not unarmed. His presence was a weapon. Clara sat beside him, rigid, her face pale as milk, clutching her folded paper in her hands. Harlan Finch and his father sat across the aisle. Harlan was dressed in his fine, black widower's suit, his face a mask of solemn piety. The circuit judge, Judge Harlan, entered. He was a stern, jowly man with a reputation for harshness and a known friendship with the Finch family. He banged his gavel. This court is in session. We are here to hear the petition of Mr. Harlan Finch for the custody of the male child, Samuel Jameson. He glanced at Clara. Mr. Finch, you may proceed. Harlan stood. He was smooth. He was humble. He was everything Luke was not. Your Honor, he began, his voice ringing with false sincerity. I am a sinful man. I admit this when I was younger, before my dear wife, before she passed. I was foolish. This woman. He gestured to Clara, his face full of a sad pity. She worked for my family. We fell into sin. I regret it more than I can say. He paused, lowering his head, as if in prayer. But I never knew. I swear on my wife's grave, I never knew she was with child. She ran. She hid. It was only when I returned to this town, a broken man, a widower, that I learned I had a son. He looked at the judge, his eyes earnest. Your Honor, that boy is my blood, my only blood. I am a man of means. I pray, a good, God-fearing man now. I want to give my son my name. I want to give him a Christian home, a life of stability. Not. His voice broke, and he gestured to where Luke sat. Not a life in that situation. With him. Living in sin. It is for the boy's welfare. That is all I ask. He sat down. A murmur went through the crowd. He had sounded reasonable. He had admitted his sin. He was offering the child a name, a future. The judge nodded, his face grim. I see. A compelling argument. Mr. Finch, Miss Jameson, do you have anything to say in response? Clara stood. Her legs felt like water. The room was a blur of faces. She saw the pastor, his arms crossed, staring at her. She saw the women, their eyes cold. She saw Harlan, his lip curled in a tiny, triumphant sneer. She looked at her paper. Her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't read the first word. Luke, beside her, reached over. He did not take the paper. He simply placed his large, steady hand over her 2 small, trembling ones. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the judge. His warmth, his strength, flowed into her. Her shaking eased. She took a breath. My name is Clara Jameson, she began, her voice a reedy whisper. Speak up, girl, the judge barked. She lifted her head. My name is Clara Jameson, she said louder. And what Mr. Finch said is a lie. She began to read. She read about the kitchen. She read about the floor and the whiskey. She read the words. He put his hand over my mouth. A gasp went through the room. Harlan Finch jumped to his feet. "That is a vile accusation. She's lying. She's hysterical." "Sit down, Mr. Finch," the judge snapped, but he was looking at Clara, his frown deepening. "Continue, Miss Jameson. But be warned, perjury is a serious crime." Clara read on. She read about being thrown out by Mrs. Finch. She read about the blizzard. And then, her voice gaining a strange, cold strength, she read about the barn. It was dark. She read, her voice clear in the dead silence. "I was alone, but for a cow. The pain, it lasted 2 days. When my son was born, I bit the cord myself. I wrapped him in my shawl. I laid down in the straw, and I prayed for us to die." No one was breathing. The women in the crowd were no longer looking at her with judgment. They were looking at her with a dawning, horrified respect. She finished. She stood, the paper trembling, her face wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. The judge stared at her. He was visibly shaken, but he was still a man of the law and a friend of the Finches. "Miss Jameson," he said, his voice gruff, "that is a terrible story, a truly terrible story. But it is just that, a story. It is your word against his. He is a man of property. You are," he cleared his throat, "you are an unwed mother, currently living with a man who is not your husband. The law is concerned only with the welfare of the child, Mr. Finch, for all his admitted failings, is offering the boy a name, a future, a respectable home. This court must lean toward—" "Judge!" The voice came from the back. It was not Luke. The crowd turned. Doc Evans stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He looked old and frail and terrified, but he was there. "Doc Evans," the judge said, annoyed. "What is the meaning of this? You are not on the docket. I am now." The doctor said, his voice shaking, but gaining strength as he walked, his boots echoing down the central aisle. I have testimony, and I must give it." He stopped, not at the witness stand, but in the center of the room, between the Finches and Clara. He looked at Luke, then at Clara, his face full of shame. "I told Mr. Mallory I wouldn't come," he said to the judge, his voice ringing. "I was a coward. I was afraid of these men." He gestured to the Finches. "I was afraid of losing my practice, of losing my home." He turned and faced the judge. "But I'd lose my soul if I stayed silent." "What is your testimony, doctor?" the judge asked, his voice now quiet. "What she said about the barn." The doctor said, "It's the truth. I found her. I own that barn. I was checking my animals in the storm, and I found her. She was just as she said, half dead with fever, the baby barely breathing." He took a step closer. "And Harlan Finch, he is a liar. That girl did not fall into sin. She was attacked." "How could you possibly know that?" Old Man Finch roared. "Because," Doc Evans said, his voice terrible and clear, "I examined her. Her dress was torn, not ripped, torn, and she had bruises. Your Honor, bruises on her wrists, bruises on her upper arms. They were," he held up his own hands, "the shape of a man's fingers, from being held down." A single, collective gasp went through the room. Clara herself was staring, her hand over her mouth. "She did not seduce anyone," the doctor finished, his voice breaking. "She survived. She survived him. She survived the winter. And she kept that child alive when any other woman would have laid down and died. That is not an unfit mother. Your Honor, that is the strongest woman I have ever known." The silence in the room was absolute. It was shattered. Luke Mallory stood up. He did not address the judge. He turned, his body rigid, and looked at the crowd. He looked at the pastor. He looked at the merchants who had warned him. He looked at the men who had jeered. "When I first came back," he said, his voice not loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife, "you told me, all of you, to stay away from her. You told me she was trouble. You told me she was filth. You—" he pointed a long, steady finger at Pastor Miles. "You told me, You'll regret her." The pastor shrank back. "I've lived with regret," Luke said, his voice raw. "It's a cold bedfellow. I know its weight. And you're right. I do have one regret in this." He turned his head, his eyes flat and gray and full of a cold, pure hatred, landing on Harlan Finch. "I regret," he said, "that I didn't find her sooner. I regret I wasn't there to keep her safe from the likes of you." Then he turned, his body, his face, everything, toward Clara, and every person in that room saw his expression change. The ice melted, the rage vanished, and all that was left was a raw, aching tenderness. "I'll regret every day I don't love her more," he said, his voice for her alone, but loud enough for all to hear. "That is the only regret I will ever have." He sat down. The courtroom was frozen. The judge looked at the Finches. Their faces were pale, their arrogance shattered. He looked at Doc Evans, who stood, shaking, but tall. He looked at Luke and Clara. He picked up his gavel. He struck it. Once, the sound was like a gunshot. "This court," he said, his voice thick. "This court finds that the child, Samuel, is the legal and rightful son of his mother, Clara Jameson. Her petition for protection is granted. Mr. Finch, your suit is dismissed with extreme prejudice. This court finds your testimony repellent." He fixed Harlan with a gaze of pure steel. "You are a disgrace, sir. A disgrace. I'm ordering you to leave this county. If you are seen in Laramie Fork after sundown tomorrow, I will have Sheriff Brody arrest you for perjury, for assault, and for any other thing I can find. This court is adjourned." It was over. People began to talk, to stand, to move. But they parted, creating an aisle. No one approached the Finches. Clara was not moving. She was staring, her paper clutched in her hand. She was shaking, inaudibly. Luke stood. He gently took the paper from her hand and folded it. He took her arm. "Clara, it's done. Let's go home." He led her, unseeing, down the aisle. A woman in the front row, a woman Clara didn't even know, was holding Samuel, who was fussy. Luke had given her 2 bits to keep him quiet. He took his son, settling him on his hip. He, Clara, and the baby. They walked out of the courthouse, into the bright, clean afternoon sun. The light was blinding. The air was fresh. Clara took 2 steps onto the boardwalk, and her legs gave out. The strength that had held her up for a year, the adrenaline that had held her up through the trial, it all vanished. She collapsed, not fainting, but folding. Luke caught her, dropping to his knees, pulling her against his chest. She broke. It was not the silent, hopeless weeping of the shack. It was a storm. Great, tearing, agonizing sobs of relief, of grief, of a pain so deep it had to be ripped out. She clung to him, her face buried in his shirt, her body racking. Luke just held her. He held her and the boy, his own face pressed into her hair, his eyes closed. He just held her on the public boardwalk, in front of the whole town. Samuel, fussy and confused by the sudden movement, squirmed in Luke's arm. Luke set him gently on the boardwalk. Between them, the boy was 9 months old, strong from a summer of good food. He was tired of being held. He looked at his mother, her shoulders shaking. He looked at Luke, whose arms were around her. He put one small, bare foot on the pine boards. He swayed. He put his other foot down. Clara's sobs hitched. She felt the movement. She lifted her head, her face a mess of tears. "Luke," she whispered, her voice choked. Luke opened his eyes. He looked down. Samuel, his face screwed up in concentration. Let go of Luke's leg. He took a step. He swayed, his arms out. He took another step. He toppled, laughing, not into the dirt, but forward, his small hands landing on Clara's knee. Clara gasped, a sound of pure, astonished joy. She let go of Luke and grabbed her son, pulling him into her lap, covering his face with kisses. He walked, she cried, laughing through the tears. Luke, he walked. Luke knelt there, his hand on her back, his other hand on his son's head. He looked at his family, together, in the sunlight. He looked up, at the townspeople, who were watching, silent. From the steps, the war was over. They had won. The trial was a wound, but a clean one. It cut deep, but it let the poison out. After that day, Harlan Finch was never seen in Laramie Fork again. His father, his pride broken, sold his holdings at the bank and moved east. A shamed and broken man. The Finches were gone. The town, left in the silence of their departure, had to look at what remained. They had to look at themselves. Months passed, the prairie summer, hot and dry, gave way to the sharp, clean gold of autumn. The new cabin was finished. It stood on its small rise, not as a monument to sin, as the pastor had feared, but as a testament to stubbornness. It was solid, with 2 glass windows that caught the morning light, and a porch that looked out over 100 miles of open country. The door was thick pine, and it had a real lock, but they never used it. Inside, it smelled of cedar and fresh bread, and the faint, sweet scent of the soap Clara made. She had taken the small space and, with a fierce, quiet energy, she had made it a home. She had sewn curtains from bleached flour sacks. She had braided a thick rug for the floor. Samuel, who was now walking with a sturdy, determined lurch, had a proper cot, carved by Luke from a smooth piece of cottonwood. Their life fell into a quiet, simple rhythm. Luke worked his land. He mended his fences, rode his lines, and began, for the first time, to build a small herd of his own, buying cattle with the last of his money. He was no longer a drifter, biding his time. He was a rancher. Clara worked the home. She tended her garden, which was bursting with corn, beans, and squash. She canned, she preserved, she cooked. She was building a defense against the memory of winter, of starvation. Their small root cellar was a fortress of plenty. The town watched. The harshness, the brittle judgment, had been cracked by the trial. It did not vanish overnight, but it began to soften, to thaw. The first offering came a week after the trial. Clara found it on the porch when she went out for wood at dawn. A large, round loaf of sourdough bread, still warm, wrapped in a clean dishcloth. There was no note. She looked out at the empty prairie, her heart tight, and took it inside. A few days later, a small bundle appeared, baby clothes, a set of woolen stockings, a small shirt, clearly outgrown but mended and clean. Then, a small sack of sugar, a jar of honey. These were the quiet apologies of the women who had seen her face in the courtroom, who had heard her read about the barn, and who had, in the privacy of their own hearts, recognized her strength. The town's peace offering became formal when Mrs. Davies, the storekeeper's wife who had once sold Luke a coat with disdain, rode out in her buggy. She stopped, not at the cabin, but at the fence. Clara, holding Samuel on her hip, walked out to meet her. "Mrs. Davies," Clara said, her voice quiet. "Clara." The older woman's face was stiff, but her eyes were not unkind. I find myself in need of some sewing, a new dress for the harvest dance. They tell me you have a fine hand with a needle." Clara stared. Mrs. Davies was the best-dressed woman in town. This was not a request for mending. It was a commission. It was an offer of work, of respect. Yes, Clara said, her voice thick. "I do." "Good." "Mrs. Davies said, nodding sharply. "I'll send the fabric out. You can name your price." She looked at Samuel, who was staring at her with wide, curious eyes. "He's a fine-looking boy." "Thank you," Clara whispered. Mrs. Davies turned to leave, then paused. "What Doc Evans said, in the court, about your strength. He was right." She clucked to her horse and drove away. Clara stood by the fence, watching her go, and, for the first time, she felt like she was a part of this land, not just a ghost haunting its edges. The work came, slowly at first, then all at once. The rancher's wife who had nodded, the blacksmith's new wife, even, to her shock, the pastor's wife. Clara was sewing again. She was earning money. She was, in her own right, a citizen. The scars, however, were deep. The past was a wolf that still circled the firelight. One night, winter had returned. The wind howled, a high, lonely sound against the new, solid walls. Clara was asleep, her body warm, her mind safe. But the sound of the wind, the same sound that had haunted her shack, was a key. She woke up, not slowly, but in a single, violent gasp. She was not in the cabin. She was in the lean-to. The door was breaking. She could smell the whiskey on the drifter's breath. "No!" she screamed, lashing out, her hands striking the darkness. "Get away! Don't touch him! Clara! Clara, wake up!" A large, calloused hand gripped her wrist. She fought, blind with terror. "Clara, it's me. It's Luke. You're safe." His voice cut through the panic. She stopped, her body rigid, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She was in their bed. The room was warm. She could smell the wood smoke from their stove. She collapsed against him, her body shaking. I'm sorry," she wept, her voice muffled against his chest. "I thought he was at the door. He was breaking in." Luke didn't say, "It's over." He didn't say, "It was just a dream." He understood. The past was never just a dream. He held her, his arms a solid wall around her. He stroked her hair, his touch a steady, grounding comfort. He waited until her breathing began to slow, until her sobs quieted. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice a low rumble in the dark. He pressed his lips to her hair. "You're here, in our home. I'm here. He'll never touch you. No one will ever touch you again." He held her tighter, pulling her close, until she was surrounded by his warmth. "You're safe," he said again, his voice raw. "You're mine now, Clara. You're mine, and I protect what's mine." She clutched his shirt, her fist tight over his heart. She believed him. The wolf was still outside, but it could never get in. She fell asleep, not to the sound of the wind, but to the slow, steady beat of his heart. Life went on. Samuel grew. He was a strong, happy child, with his mother's dark hair and, Luke suspected, his own stubborn will. One clear, cold afternoon, when the last of the autumn leaves clung to the cottonwoods, Luke led a small, shaggy pony to the cabin. It was old and gentle, and he'd traded a good saddle for it. Samuel, who was now almost 2, squealed with a joy that was sharp and pure. "He's too little," Clara said, coming out onto the porch, her sewing in her hands. She was working on a new flannel shirt for Luke, the one he'd need for the deep winter. "He's not too little to learn." Luke said that rare, unused smile touched his mouth. He lifted Samuel, who was a solid, wriggling weight, and sat him on the pony's broad back. The boy's legs stuck straight out. He grabbed the pony's mane in 2 small, tight fists. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured, his voice for his son. He kept one large hand on Samuel's back, holding him steady, and took the pony's lead rope in the other. He began to walk, leading them in a slow, careful circle in the yard. Samuel was not afraid. He was laughing, a high, clear sound that echoed in the clean air. He was the son of a cowboy, and he knew it. Clara sat on the porch step, the new shirt forgotten in her lap. She watched them. She watched this tall, quiet, scarred man, who had held her son against his skin to save his life, now leading him on his first horse. She watched her son, his face bright with pure, uncomplicated joy. Luke caught her eye. He saw the look on her face, the tears standing in her eyes, the smile that lit her from the inside. A sound bubbled up in her chest, a laugh. It was not the rusty, broken sound he'd heard in the spring. It was a full, warm, happy laugh. It was the sound of a woman who was, finally, home. The town, it seemed, had one last test for them. The fire broke out in the dead of winter. It was a bitter night. The stars so close and cold you could almost touch them. A bell began to ring, frantic and desperate, the sound carrying for miles across the frozen, silent prairie. Luke was awake in an instant. He went to the window. A red, Angry glow lit the sky to the east. The town. "Stay here," he said to Clara, who was already out of bed, her face pale. "Bar the door!" He didn't waste a second. He was dressed and had his horse saddled in less than 2 minutes. He rode, not as a man going to help, but as a man going to war. He rode into the smoke. It was the hotel. The 2-story wooden building was a torch, flames roaring from the ground floor, smoke pouring from the upstairs windows. The rusted spur, next door, was already catching. The wind was high, fanning the flames, sending embers raining down on the nearby roofs. The town was in chaos. Men, half-dressed, formed a ragged bucket brigade from the town well, but the water was freezing, and the effort was hopeless. They were just trying to save the adjoining buildings. A woman was screaming. She was standing in the snow in her nightdress, her hair wild. It was Silas Croft's wife, the new one. Silas, his face black with soot, was trying to hold her back. "My boy!" she shrieked, her voice high and piercing. "Jamie, he's still in there. He was asleep. He's on the 2nd floor." "The stairs are gone!" Silas yelled, his voice raw with despair. "We can't get to him." Luke slid from his horse. He saw it all in one glance. The roaring fire, the weeping mother, the men, standing helpless. He saw the pastor, his face pale, praying by the well. Luke ran to the water trough. He grabbed a horse blanket, soaked it, and threw it over his head. "Mallory, don't!" Sheriff Brody yelled. "It's a death trap! The whole thing is coming down!" Luke ignored him. He ran to the side of the building, where a narrow porch roof ran under the 2nd-story windows. He grabbed a post, hauled his body up, and kicked in the glass of the nearest window. He disappeared into the thick, black smoke. The town held its breath. The woman's scream stopped, replaced by a choked, terrible silence. All anyone could hear was the roar of the fire. "He's dead," someone whispered. "The roof's going." The front of the hotel sagged, a groan of dying timbers. And then he was there. He appeared at the broken window, a black shape against the orange hell inside. He was holding a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. "Catch him!" Luke roared, his voice thick. He dropped the child. Silas Croft and 2 other men leaped forward, their arms outstretched, and caught the boy. Luke swung his legs over the sill, his own clothes smoking. He jumped, landing hard in the snow, rolling to put out the small flames that licked at his coat. He lay there for a second, coughing, the smoke tearing at his lungs. The hotel roof collapsed, sending a volcano of sparks into the night sky. The woman, clasping her child, was weeping, her voice a raw chant of "Thank you, thank you." Luke pushed himself to his knees. A hand reached down to help him up. It was Pastor Miles. His face was covered in soot, his eyes wide with an emotion that was almost fear. God bless you, son," the pastor whispered, his voice shaking. He clapped Luke on the shoulder, his grip tight. You are a righteous man, Luke Mallory." Luke just nodded, coughing, and went to find his horse. His bravery, his complete disregard for his own life, had done what no trial, no argument, could have. He hadn't just saved a child. He had saved their child. He had risked his life for the town that had despised him. The harvest dance, held late in the fall, had been postponed by the fire. They held it in the spring, a celebration of the thaw, of survival. Luke told Clara they were going. "Going," she said, her hands freezing on the bread dough she was kneading. "Into town, to the dance." "Yes, but, Luke, they don't want us." The old fear, the old habit of hiding, was strong. "They do," he said, "and even if they didn't, we're going." She made a new dress, a simple, dark blue calico. She ironed his good shirt, the one she had sewn. They rode into town, not in the wagon, but on horseback, side by side. Luke left Samuel with Mrs. Brody, the sheriff's wife, who had insisted. They walked into the town hall. The fiddlers were playing. The room was bright with lanterns and full of people. The music stopped. The talking stopped. Every eye in Laramie Fork turned to the door. To them, Luke Mallory, tall and imposing, his eyes missing nothing, and Clara Jameson, pale, but not frightened. She held her head high. She was beautiful. Luke ignored the silence. He put his hand on the small of her back and guided her to the center of the floor. He nodded to the fiddlers. "Play," he said. The fiddler, startled, struck up a waltz. Luke put his arm around Clara's waist. He took her hand, and he began to dance. No one sneered. No one whispered. The men watched Luke, and they saw the man who had walked into a burning building. The man who had faced down Harlan Finch, the man who had claimed this woman and built her a house with his bare hands. And they nodded, one by one. The women watched Clara. They saw the simple, perfect dress she had made. They saw the way her hand rested in Luke's, the way her eyes, once haunted, now looked only at him, full of a fierce, quiet love. And they nodded. Luke danced her past the punch bowl. Pastor Miles was standing there, his cup in his hand. He looked at Luke, he looked at Clara, and he raised his cup in a small, respectful salute. Then he turned to his wife and led her onto the floor. The spell was broken, the room filled with dancers. Luke and Clara waltzed, a quiet island in the center of the swirling room, belonging to no one but each other. That night, they rode home under a sky so vast and clear it hurt to look at. The stars were a spill of diamonds, the air cold and sharp. Samuel was asleep in his cot, safe. They stood on the porch for a long time, just breathing. The silence of the prairie was a comfort. "Clara," Luke said, his voice quiet. She turned to him. He wasn't a man for pretty words. He didn't kneel. He didn't have a speech. He just took her hand. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. It was a ring, not gold, not silver. It was a simple, thin band, carved from a piece of dark, smooth wood. He'd been working on it for weeks. In the evenings, whittling it by the firelight. He took her left hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Clara's breath hitched. She looked at the ring, then at his face, her eyes shining in the starlight. Tears began to well, spilling over, warm on her cold cheeks. She touched his face, her hand trembling. "You'll regret this," she whispered. It was the last dying breath of the old shame, the old fear that she was not, could not, be good enough. Luke pulled her close. He wrapped his arms around her, his grip tight, possessive, and safe. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "I'll regret not loving you more," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "That's the only thing I'd ever regret." He kissed her, a long, slow kiss under the stars. It was not a kiss of passion or of healing. It was a kiss of promise. The next morning, the dawn broke clear and cold. The prairie was painted in pale shades of gold and pink. Luke brought the horses around. He lifted Samuel, who was awake and bundled in his coat, and set him in the saddle in front of him. Clara mounted her own horse. They didn't look back at the cabin. It would be there when they returned, side by side, a family. They rode out into the vast, open land. They rode west, toward the rising mountains, the sun warm on their backs. Their future was as uncertain, as dangerous, and as wide as the country in front of them. But for the first time, it was finally, completely, their own. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment and let us know. For more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West. We appreciate your support, and we look forward to reading your thoughts in English.